hearing this, you should know you're not alone.
They were waiting for us. They've been studying us. Now they're coming.
Message received. The expedition has begun its descent.
Earth, I have arrived. There's someone here.
We didn't survive. We became something else.
The ship was coming in too fast. Marta could feel it in the way her body was pressed into the seat, in the way the cabin rattled and groaned, the hull shrieking under the force of their descent. Peter's voice cut through the alarms, trying to stabilize their approach. George was silent, his jaw locked tight. Thomas, beside Marta, was gripping his restraints, his face pale. "Pull up! Pull up!" the pilot screamed. Then the mountain rose up beneath them. The impact was immediate and violent. Metal crunched, glass shattered, bodies lurched forward as the ship tore into the rock, skipping like a stone before grinding to a final, devastating halt. For a long moment, everything was silent except for the ticking of the cooling metal and the ragged, uneven breathing of the survivors. Marta moved first, fighting against the restraints and the weight of a collapsed panel pinning her arm. The cabin lights flickered weakly, casting eerie shadows across the twisted wreckage. Smoke filled the air, and outside, the sky beyond the cracked viewport was an unnatural shade of purple. "Pilot?" Peter rasped, coughing. "Status?" No response. Marta forced herself up, her limbs screaming in protest. She turned her head and saw him, or what was left of him. The front section of the cockpit had been crushed inward, and the pilot was a twisted, lifeless shape among the wreckage. Blood drifted lazily in the low gravity, suspended like tiny red planets. "He's gone," she said, her voice barely audible. George exhaled sharply. Peter cursed. Then Marta heard the sound that made her stomach drop. Thomas groaning in pain. She turned quickly, eyes searching until she saw him slumped against the shattered console, his face twisted in agony. His left leg was bent at a horrific angle, bone pushing against the fabric of his suit. Blood was pooling beneath him. Peter was already moving, reaching for the emergency kit. "Hold on, Thomas. Stay with us." Thomas let out a weak, gasping laugh. "Not going anywhere," he muttered. Marta helped stabilize him while Peter worked to stop the bleeding. George was quiet, watching the way Thomas's skin had already begun to pale. The temperature in the cabin was dropping fast. Their ship was dead, and without its systems, they wouldn't last long up here. "We need to move," George said. Marta nodded. The ship had crashed in the mountains, but they had to descend, had to find warmth. Water, something. Through the shattered viewport, she could see the landscape stretching endlessly below them, rolling plains leading to a dark, distant ocean. That was where they had originally planned to land, where their supplies and survival plans had been meant to unfold. Now, everything had changed. The descent was slow, each step deliberate. They carried what little supplies they could salvage, including an emergency rover they had managed to assemble. Thomas lay across it, his face slick with sweat, his fever worsening. The first thing they noticed was the air, thin, metallic, unbreathable at first. Their suits' oxygen levels were dwindling, forcing them to move quickly. Every step felt heavier than it should, the planet's strange gravity making them sluggish. Then, as they moved lower, something shifted. Peter stopped first, testing the air. He exhaled inside his helmet, then hesitantly reached for the seal. "Might be breathable," he said. George frowned. "Might kill you." "Only one way to find out." Peter disengaged the lock. Marta held her breath as he pulled the helmet off, inhaling cautiously. A long silence. Then Peter let out a slow breath and gave a tight nod. "We're good." One by one, they removed their helmets, taking in the crisp, strangely cool air. It was rich, full of something unfamiliar but not unpleasant. Different but survivable. For a moment, there was relief. Then Thomas groaned again, his body convulsing weakly. The fever was getting worse. They pressed on. They found the ruins by accident. The sun, or whatever passed for a sun here, was lowering when Marta spotted the first structure. It was nothing more than a crumbling stone pillar, half buried in the earth, but as they moved forward, they saw more. Broken walls, staircases leading to nowhere, the remnants of something once great, now long abandoned. George ran a gloved hand over the surface of one of the structures. This wasn't natural, Marta shivered. There was life here once. Not anymore. She turned to look at Thomas, whose breathing had turned shallow. It was happening too fast. His fever was burning hotter than it should. The wound was festering even though they had treated it. Time felt strange here. Too fast. She knelt beside him, pressing her hands against his damp skin. "Thomas," she whispered. His eyes fluttered open, unfocused. He looked at her, then past her, his gaze unfixed, searching. "Don't forget," he rasped. Marta leaned closer. "Forget what?" His lips parted, and for a moment it seemed as though he was trying to say more, but the words never came. Then his body went still. Marta shook her head. "Number." No, stay with me." Peter was already pulling her back. "Marta." She struggled against him, against the reality pressing in around her. But Thomas was gone. The wind howled through the ruins, carrying the echoes of things long dead. That night, the storm came. It rolled over the mountains like a living thing, black clouds curling over the sky, lightning cutting jagged scars through the darkness. The wind turned to a scream, and rain came down in sheets, lashing against them. Then the flood came. Marta held onto Thomas's body as the water rose. It surged through the ruins, dragging debris and bodies alike. The others fought to keep their footing, but Marta refused to let go. Even as the river swelled, even as the current tried to steal him from her, she clung to his lifeless form, her knuckles white. "Help me!" she screamed, but the storm swallowed her words. It felt like hours before the waters receded. By morning, everything had changed again. They buried Thomas on a hill overlooking the ruins, marking his grave with a simple stone. Then, with nothing left to do, they turned toward the sea. The waves were calm when they reached the shore. Marta, Peter, and George stood there for a long time, staring at the endless expanse of water, letting the salt, heavy air wash over them. After everything, the crash, Thomas's death, the storm, they had finally reached where they were supposed to land. But the planet had already rewritten their plans. There was no way back. The rovers had barely survived the journey. They had salvaged what they could from the wreck, but supplies were running thin. They needed food, shelter, something to sustain them. The first sign of life came in the shallows. Small, darting creatures, nothing like anything on Earth, but unmistakably organic. Peter caught the first one, holding its squirming body in his hands, studying it. "We eat it, or we die," he said. George hesitated, but Marta took the creature and drove her knife into it. Blood, not red, but a deep violet, spilled onto the sand. When they cooked it over a fire, it smelled strange but edible. That night they sat together, eating in silence, the fire casting flickering shadows on their faces. The planet had given them something to survive. Days passed, then weeks. Marta was the first to realize she was pregnant. The moment she told Peter, something changed in him. He had spent the past weeks restless, pacing the shore, staring out at the water as if he could will a way back to Earth. But now his thoughts were anchored to something real, something immediate, a new life. When the baby came, it was Thomas. Not the Thomas they had buried in the ruins, but Thomas II, a boy born into a world with no past, only a future. Then the strangeness of the planet made itself known again. At 6 months, Thomas II was the size of a 1-year-old. His growth was unnatural, accelerated beyond anything Marta or Peter had expected. It didn't stop. Every day he changed more. His body adapted to the planet in ways they couldn't explain. Peter became obsessed. He started keeping notes, measuring the way time twisted here. "We won't live long enough to see him grow up," he muttered one night, staring at the fire. Marta held the boy in her arms. "We'll be here as long as we can." More children followed. Marta gave birth again and again, and each time they grew faster than the last. Soon there were too many to count. Their small camp expanded, huts rising from the earth. They learned to sew clothes from the fibers of the strange plants growing inland. They built tools, dug irrigation channels. Marta painted their faces with the dyes she made from crushed leaves, marking them as something new, something separate from what they had been. George, the last link to the world they had left behind, watched with quiet unease. He tried to teach them, tried to pass on the knowledge of Earth, of history, of everything that had come before. But the children weren't interested. They were creatures of this world now, and Earth was a story with no meaning to them. Peter's thoughts grew darker. "What have we lost?" he asked one night, staring at the sky. "What have we gained?" Marta didn't answer. George kept his records, but fewer and fewer of the children listened. The past was slipping away, and soon the old world would only exist in whispers. One night, Peter broke. He had been rambling about philosophy, about the nature of time, about how everything they knew had been stripped away. When George remained silent, detached, unbothered, Peter lost control. He struck him. Again and again. Marta pulled him back, screaming, but Peter wasn't himself. His fevered mind had lost its grip. When he finally stopped, George was left bleeding in the sand. Then the ground shook. The first explosion ripped through the coastline. Then another. The land itself seemed to be shifting, a deep, guttural sound rising from beneath them. The beach cracked apart. Peter tried to run, but the ground buckled beneath him. A wall of rock and sand came crashing down, swallowing him whole. Marta screamed, but he was gone. When the shaking stopped, only the children remained. They buried Peter next to the ocean, where the tide could reach him. Marta mourned. Then she moved on. The world didn't wait for grief. The children grew. They became a people, their numbers multiplying faster than seemed possible. And when Marta looked at them, she saw something new. A world starting over. George had only been gone for a few years, or at least that was how it felt to him. Time worked differently here. He had wandered into the mountains alone, searching for metal ores and materials, trying to give the next generation something more than just survival. But when he returned, the world had changed again. The children were no longer just children. They had multiplied, growing into a people. The huts had become homes. The paths they once walked were now roads. Smoke rose from cooking fires, and laughter echoed between wooden structures. Their language had started to shift, words merging and shortening into something unfamiliar, and they worshipped him. George had barely stepped into the village when they surrounded him, eyes wide with reverence. The elders, men and women barely in their 20s but already ancient by the planet's standards, knelt before him. "Father has returned," one of them whispered. He didn't understand at first. Then he saw the carvings, Marta and Peter, their faces etched into stone. In the stories they had left behind, Marta had become the mother, the creator of their people. Peter was the martyr, the one who had given his life to the land. And George? George was the teacher, the father of knowledge. His journals, the ones he had written in a desperate attempt to preserve Earth's history, had become scripture. The children, now adults, now leaders, quoted them like holy text. "Man must learn, or man will fall," one said. "Time is our enemy, but also our path," another recited. George felt sick. He had left for what felt like a moment. But here, entire generations had passed, and in that time the past had twisted. Then Thomas II stepped forward. He was a man now, broad-shouldered and powerful. His dark hair had grown long, tied back in the style of warriors. He carried a staff, not for walking, but as a symbol of rule. The first king of this world. "You have returned to guide us," Thomas II said. George shook his head. "I didn't leave to be a god." "But you are," Thomas II said simply. The people cheered. George wanted to argue, but what was the point? The truth had already been buried beneath myth. For the next year, he tried to lead them, to remind them of reason, to teach them the things that mattered. But belief had already settled in their bones. They would listen to him, but only as a prophet. Then Thomas II came to him again, this time with an urgent message. "I have seen others," he said, "across the ocean." George frowned. "What do you mean?" "Lights, moving figures. There are others like us beyond the sea. George's stomach twisted. You don't know that? I do, Thomas II insisted. I have seen them. The people had already gathered behind him, waiting for George's blessing. You can't go, George warned. You don't know what's out there. But Thomas II wasn't a child anymore. He was a leader, a king, and a king didn't ask permission. They built boats, crude but strong, carving them from the great trees inland. When the tide was high, Thomas II and his men pushed off, their sails catching the wind. George watched them go, knowing he wouldn't see them again. Weeks passed, then months. One day, a single boat returned. Thomas II was alone. His face was gaunt, his body thinner than before. He staggered onto the shore, collapsing in the sand. George was the first to reach him. What happened? Thomas II looked up, eyes hollow. The cities were there, he whispered. George's blood ran cold. Cities. Ruins, Thomas II corrected. But not empty. There were things there. Winged creatures with a single eye. They killed my men. They saw me. And they are coming. The people gathered around them, murmurs spreading like wildfire. They are coming, Thomas II said again, louder this time. And just like that, the myths changed again. Fear spread through the tribe. The once celebrated journey across the ocean became a warning. The world was not theirs alone, and the monsters were coming. George's hands trembled as he fastened the final bolts. The small vessel stood before him, a fragile thing of salvaged metal and frayed wiring, built from the bones of the ship that had brought them here. The wreckage of their arrival had been picked clean long ago, repurposed for tools, weapons, even shelters. But George had never stopped coming back, because he had always known this moment would come. The old recorder sat in his lap, filled with years of footage, his voice, his face, his slow descent into something less than human. His skin had wrinkled, his hair thinned, and his body ached from the weight of too many years lived too quickly. He had spent decades here, though in his mind it still felt like only a short chapter of his life. He pressed record one last time. To whoever finds this, he began, his voice rough with age, this is what became of us. He spoke of the crash, of Thomas, of Marta, of Peter. He spoke of the first children, of the tribe, of how time had turned against them. He told them of the religion that had formed, the myths that had swallowed history whole. And then he spoke of the creatures. They will come for us, he whispered. Thomas II saw them across the ocean, and now they are coming. And I don't know if we can stop them. He paused, closing his eyes. I don't know if we should. The Shern had been something before. He had seen it in Thomas II's haunted face, in the ruins he had described. They had built cities. They had lived. And then, like humans, they had collapsed. Their civilization had fallen, and now they were something else. Something monstrous. The door to the vessel hissed shut as he activated the launch sequence. The small rocket wouldn't take a man back. It didn't have the power to escape the planet's gravity. But the drive, the footage, the message, those could reach Earth. Someone needed to know. As the countdown reached 0, the vessel fired upward, splitting the sky. It rose higher, faster, until it was gone, leaving behind only the old man who had built it. George exhaled and turned away. He made his way back down the mountain, back toward the sea, toward the only thing that still mattered, the people. Earth received the message years later. By the time they watched George's final recording, his voice was a whisper from another age. His warnings crackled through their speakers, his face flickering on their screens, his time-worn eyes staring straight into theirs. And they answered. They sent a man. Mark was chosen for the mission, trained for it. He had studied every second of George's footage, memorized every word, every warning. But none of it prepared him for what he saw when he arrived. They were waiting for him. The moment his ship broke through the atmosphere, they were already gathered on the shore. Priests, draped in ceremonial robes, their faces painted in patterns older than their memories, they stood in silent reverence as Mark descended. His coming had been prophesized. He stepped onto the sand, his boots sinking slightly, and the weight of their stares pressed down on him like gravity itself. They believed he was the victor, the one who would liberate them. The war had already begun before he arrived. The Shern had come just as Thomas II had warned. They had crossed the ocean bringing slaughter and fire. The humans who remained, descendants of Marta, of Peter, of George, had fought back, retreating into underground settlements, building walls, forging weapons, and waiting for their savior. But Mark was no god. The Shern attacked soon after his arrival, their winged forms cutting through the sky, their single eyes gleaming with something beyond hunger, beyond rage. Mark fought to survive, carried through tunnels into the heart of the underground city. There they showed him the church, the cult of George. It was carved into the walls, written in symbols and words twisted from English into something else. George the teacher, Marta the mother, Peter the martyr, and now Mark the victor. They brought him before the high priest, Maluda, who spoke of destiny, of the final war. They offered him a wife, Ezal, daughter of the priest, because it had been written that he would take her. Mark didn't know what was real anymore. He met the Shern leader, on the shore. I spoke to him not with words, but with thoughts, pouring into his mind like a flood, unraveling him. Mark felt himself unraveling, felt something dark clawing at his brain, whispering truths that had been buried even before he was born. He almost fell to it. But Ezel arrived, and I fell. The people rejoiced, believing Mark had slain the creature. They carried him back, singing songs of victory. He had become the thing he feared, a god. They begged him to lead them across the ocean, to destroy the Shern in their cities, to end the war once and for all. Mark saw the remains of the Shern civilization, the broken towers, the remnants of their lost world, and in them he saw Earth. They had once been like humans, and now humans were becoming them. He tried to stop it. He tried to change the way they ruled, to end the violence before it became something worse. But it was too late. The people had outgrown him. They whispered doubts. They questioned his role. And then they turned on him. When he returned from the failed war, he was no longer the victor. He was a coward, a false prophet. They stripped him of his title. They mocked him in the streets. Then they crucified him. He hung there, arms spread wide, the sun burning his skin, the people throwing stones at his feet. and Izal stood beneath him, watching. Mark lifted his head, staring at the horizon, where the ocean met the sky. It was happening again. It would always happen again.